Disrespect does not always announce itself. It doesn't arrive shouting or slamming doors. More often, it slips into your day quietly, through a tone that lingers too long, a look that dismisses without words, a moment where your contribution is ignored and quickly replaced. At work, you tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself to stay professional, to stay focused, to move on. But something stays behind. It settles into your chest, follows you out of the building, rides home with you in silence. And by the time you sit down at home, you are no longer just tired. You are carrying something that was never meant to leave the workplace. What makes this kind of disrespect dangerous is not its intensity, but its persistence. Day after day, it teaches your mind to replay conversations that should have ended hours ago. It changes the way you speak to your family, the way you listen, the way you rest. You become quieter, more distant, not because you lack strength, but because your strength has been used up surviving small, constant dismissals. This is how professional environments quietly invade personal peace, without permission, without warning, without mercy. And the hardest part is this: no one sees it. From the outside, you are functioning. You show up, you perform, you fulfill expectations. But inside, something is being worn down. Confidence begins to hesitate. Self-respect starts negotiating its place. You begin to question whether the problem is the environment or you. This is where disrespect does its deepest damage, not to your career, but to your sense of self. Tonight, this is not a speech about anger. It is not about blame. It is about awareness, about recognizing that what you tolerate repeatedly shapes who you become quietly. Because when workplace disrespect follows you home, it doesn't just affect your evenings. It begins to rewrite your identity, and that is a cost too high for any job to demand. The quiet contagion of disrespect that enters before you can name it. Disrespect in the workplace rarely announces itself in a way that allows you to defend against it immediately. It does not always come as open hostility or clear conflict. More often, it appears subtle, disguised as humor that cuts a little too deep, feedback that feels intentionally vague, or silence where acknowledgement should have existed. At first, you brush it aside because you have responsibilities, goals, and a reputation to maintain. You tell yourself that maturity means endurance, that professionalism means not reacting. But what you fail to notice in those early moments is that disrespect behaves like a quiet contagion. It spreads not through one dramatic incident, but through repetition. Each small dismissal teaches your nervous system to stay alert, to brace itself, to expect less fairness tomorrow than you hoped for today. Over time, this subtle disrespect begins to reshape how you experience your workday. You walk into meetings already calculating what not to say. You edit your tone before you even speak. You prepare explanations in advance for mistakes that have not yet been made. None of this happens because you lack confidence. It happens because your environment has trained you to associate visibility with risk. The quiet contagion works by making capable people cautious, thoughtful people silent, and dedicated people emotionally distant. And because it never explodes all at once, it convinces you that what you're experiencing is normal, manageable, or simply part of adult life. What makes this form of disrespect especially dangerous is its ability to follow you beyond the workplace without you realizing when it crossed the line. You leave the office physically, but mentally you are still there, replaying interactions, reanalyzing expressions, questioning intentions. Your body goes home, but your mind remains at work, trying to solve problems that are not technical but emotional. This is where the contagion deepens. Disrespect no longer needs the presence of the people who initiated it. It continues on its own, inside you, long after the workday has ended. The silence of your home becomes filled with unfinished conversations and unspoken responses. As days turn into weeks, the emotional residue begins to show up in unexpected ways. You feel drained even after resting. Small inconveniences feel heavier than they should. Conversations with loved ones require more effort, not because they are difficult, but because you are already carrying a load you never set down. The quiet contagion of disrespect steals energy without making noise. It does not demand your attention openly. It slowly withdraws your capacity to feel light, present, and grounded. This is why people often mistake it for burnout, stress, or fatigue, when in reality it is unprocessed disrespect accumulating without release. One of the most troubling effects of this process is how it alters your internal dialogue. Disrespect repeated often enough begins to sound like your own thoughts. You start questioning whether you are too sensitive, too slow, too replaceable, or simply not enough. The environment may never say these words directly, but the pattern teaches them anyway. This is how external behavior becomes internal belief. The contagion is complete when you begin defending the very treatment that is draining you, telling yourself that it's just how things are, that others have it worse, that you should be grateful to be where you are. And yet, the truth is simple and uncomfortable. No environment has the right to steadily erode your sense of dignity. Disrespect does not need to be loud to be harmful, and it does not need to be intentional to be real. Its impact is measured not by what others can see, but by what you carry in silence. When left unexamined, it teaches you to minimize your needs, delay your boundaries, and postpone your well-being for the sake of appearing strong. Recognizing this quiet contagion is not about creating conflict or assigning blame. It is about clarity, about noticing patterns instead of isolated moments, about understanding that professionalism should never require emotional self-neglect. The moment you name what is happening, its power begins to weaken. Awareness interrupts the spread. When you realize that what follows you home is not weakness, but accumulated disrespect, you stop internalizing it as a personal failure. This is where strength quietly returns, not through confrontation, but through self-respect, through the decision to separate your worth from how consistently others acknowledge it. The quiet contagion thrives in unspoken acceptance, but it struggles in the presence of awareness, and once you see it clearly, you gain the ability to choose what you carry forward and what you leave behind where it belongs. When your job title quietly starts defining your human value, there is a moment most people never notice when it first happens. A moment when professional feedback stops being about performance and slowly begins to feel like a judgment of character. At work, roles are meant to organize responsibility, not measure human worth. Yet in environments where respect is inconsistent, the two begin to merge. You are no longer just doing a job. You are being evaluated as a person through the lens of productivity, obedience, and visibility. Over time, the distinction between who you are and what you do starts to blur, and without realizing it, you begin carrying workplace opinions into your personal sense of identity. This shift does not occur overnight. It builds quietly through repeated exposure to dismissal, unequal treatment, or recognition that is selectively distributed. When effort goes unnoticed while mistakes are magnified, the mind searches for explanations. And in the absence of fairness, it often turns inward. You begin to ask yourself if you are truly competent, if your presence matters, if your voice deserves space. These questions are not born from weakness. They are learned responses to environments that reward compliance more than contribution. The danger is not the questions themselves, but how often they are asked until they feel like facts. As this pattern continues, the workplace becomes more than a place of employment. It becomes a mirror you consult too often. Performance reviews, casual remarks, and even silence begin shaping how you see yourself outside of work. You measure your day's worth by how useful you were to someone else. You carry success home like temporary relief and failure home like permanent evidence. Slowly, personal confidence becomes conditional. You feel lighter on days you are praised and heavier on days you are overlooked. This is not ambition. This is emotional dependence on external validation disguised as professionalism. The most damaging part of this process is how it changes your internal standards. You begin holding yourself to rules no one else is required to follow. You tolerate behavior from others that you would never justify in your personal relationships. You excuse disrespect by labeling it as pressure, leadership style, or workplace culture. Meanwhile, your self-talk becomes harsher, more demanding, less forgiving. You expect yourself to endure without complaint, to adapt without acknowledgement, to perform without pause. In doing so, you unknowingly train yourself to believe that your value must be constantly proven. Eventually, this internalized pressure follows you into your private life. At home, rest no longer feels earned unless the day was productive. Joy feels irresponsible when tasks remain unfinished. You struggle to be present with people who care about you because a part of you is still seeking approval from a system that cannot offer it consistently. Even in moments of quiet, your mind remains alert, reviewing what you could have done better, what you should have said differently. The job may end at a certain hour, but the self-judgment does not. What makes this especially difficult to escape is how normalized it has become. Many people wear exhaustion like a badge of honor and self-doubt like humility. Questioning your worth is mistaken for self-awareness. Overworking is praised as dedication. In such environments, separating your identity from your role can feel almost rebellious. You may fear that without constant performance, you will disappear, be replaced, or lose relevance. This fear is not accidental. It is the byproduct of systems that benefit from individuals who tie their self-worth to output. But the truth remains unchanged, no matter how convincing the illusion becomes. A job title is not a verdict on your value. It is a function, not a definition. When you allow a role to dictate your sense of self, you give away authority that was never meant to be external. Your skills can be evaluated, your performance can be improved, but your dignity, intelligence, and humanity are not negotiable metrics. They exist independently of any organization's approval. Reclaiming this separation does not require bitterness or withdrawal. It requires perspective. It begins with recognizing that feedback is information, not identity. That productivity is an action, not a measure of worth. When you stop letting professional roles rewrite personal value, something steadies inside you. You work with clarity instead of fear. You rest without guilt. You engage with others without carrying invisible scores or silent verdicts. This shift is subtle but profound. You no longer shrink on difficult days or inflate on successful ones. You remain grounded. And in that grounding, workplace disrespect loses its ability to follow you home, because it no longer has permission to define who you are when the workday ends. The hidden exhaustion of carrying emotional weight no one acknowledges. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix because it does not come from physical effort or long hours alone. It comes from the constant management of emotions in spaces where you are expected to remain composed no matter what is placed on your shoulders. In workplaces where respect is inconsistent, emotional control becomes an unspoken job requirement. You learn to regulate your reactions, soften your responses, and suppress discomfort in order to keep things running smoothly. This labor is invisible, unpaid, and rarely acknowledged, yet it consumes more energy than most people realize. By the end of the day, you are not tired because of what you did, but because of what you had to hold inside. This emotional weight builds through countless small moments. You pause before responding, not to be thoughtful, but to avoid consequences. You swallow frustration during meetings, reframe disrespect as misunderstanding, and carry on as if nothing happened. Each time you do this, you are performing emotional labor, absorbing tension so that others remain comfortable. Over time, your nervous system learns that vigilance is safer than honesty. You stay alert, careful, and restrained, even when no immediate threat exists. This constant self-monitoring slowly drains your mental and emotional reserves, leaving little energy for creativity, connection, or rest. What makes this burden particularly heavy is that it is often misunderstood as professionalism. You are praised for being calm, flexible, and resilient, without anyone recognizing the cost of maintaining that composure. The environment benefits from your emotional regulation while remaining unaware of the toll it takes on you. You become the stable presence, the reliable one, the person who can handle pressure. But handling pressure repeatedly without release does not build strength. It builds fatigue. And because this fatigue is internal, it often goes unnoticed until it begins to affect your life outside of work. At home, the effects of this hidden exhaustion become more visible. You find yourself quieter than before, less responsive, less engaged. Conversations require effort because you have already spent the day managing tone, expression, and reaction. Even moments of rest feel shallow, interrupted by lingering tension in your body. You may withdraw without intending to, not because you lack care, but because you are emotionally depleted. This is how emotional labor follows you home, not as anger, but as absence, not as conflict, but as disconnection. Over time, this constant emotional restraint can distort your relationship with your own feelings. You become skilled at dismissing discomfort quickly, telling yourself it's not worth addressing. You minimize your reactions, second-guess your instincts, and delay emotional expression until it feels safer, which may never come. In doing so, you slowly lose touch with what you genuinely feel, replacing authenticity with adaptation. This self-silencing is not a personal flaw. It is a learned survival strategy in environments that discourage emotional honesty. The danger of unacknowledged emotional labor is that it teaches you to equate endurance with strength. You pride yourself on being able to handle it, even as your inner world grows heavier. But strength without support eventually turns into isolation. When no one sees the weight you carry, you begin to feel unseen as a whole person. This invisibility can be more damaging than overt conflict, because it erodes your sense of belonging and validation at the same time. Recognizing this hidden exhaustion is not about rejecting responsibility or avoiding challenges. It is about understanding that emotional regulation has limits. You are not meant to absorb endless tension without relief. Emotional labor becomes sustainable only when it is balanced with respect, acknowledgement, and space for honest expression. Without these, it becomes a slow drain that impacts your well-being long after the workday ends. The moment you begin to name this experience, its hold on you weakens. Awareness allows you to separate what is required of your role from what is asked of your humanity. You begin to notice when emotional labor crosses into emotional neglect. And in that noticing, you regain choice. Choice to set internal boundaries. Choice to release what was never yours to carry alone. This is where healing begins, not with confrontation, but with permission. Permission to feel without justification. Permission to rest without guilt. Permission to stop performing emotional stability at the cost of your own peace. When you honor the weight you've been carrying silently, you begin to put it down. And in that act, you reclaim energy, presence, and a sense of self that exists beyond constant emotional control. The slow damage of silence. When endurance turns into self-betrayal, silence is often mistaken for wisdom in professional spaces. You are taught that restraint is maturity, that choosing your battles is intelligence, that keeping the peace is a sign of strength, and in certain moments, silence can indeed be strategic. But when silence becomes a permanent response to repeated disrespect, it stops being strength and slowly turns into self-betrayal. Each unspoken boundary, each swallowed objection, each moment you tell yourself, "It's not worth it," leaves a quiet mark. Over time, those marks accumulate, shaping not just how others treat you, but how you treat yourself. At first, staying silent feels practical. You want to avoid conflict, protect your position, and maintain professionalism. You convince yourself that speaking up would only create problems or paint you as difficult. So you adapt. You lower expectations, accept dismissive behavior, and tell yourself that endurance is part of the process. But what often goes unnoticed is that every time you choose silence, you send a message inward, a message that your discomfort is secondary, a message that your boundaries are flexible, a message that your voice can wait, and the mind learns quickly from repetition. As this pattern continues, silence begins to follow you home. You stop articulating frustration even in safe spaces. When loved ones ask how your day was, you respond with short, neutral answers, not because nothing happened, but because you've trained yourself to minimize your experience. You grow accustomed to carrying unresolved tension quietly, believing that expressing it would be burdensome or pointless. This is how prolonged silence creates emotional isolation, not through lack of connection, but through habit. The deeper cost of this silence lies in its effect on self-trust. When you consistently ignore your internal signals, you begin to doubt them. You second-guess your reactions, question your perceptions, and hesitate to validate your own feelings. Over time, this erodes confidence at a foundational level. You are no longer just silent outwardly, you are silent inwardly as well. The internal dialogue that once defended your dignity becomes quieter, replaced by rationalizations and justifications for behavior that should have been challenged. This internal silencing also reshapes your relationships. You may become more accommodating than necessary, more cautious than required, more distant than intended. You avoid difficult conversations even when they are essential, because your system has learned that speaking up leads to discomfort or risk. The result is a life where harmony is maintained on the surface, but authenticity is gradually sacrificed. And while this may reduce immediate tension, it increases long-term dissatisfaction and emotional fatigue. What makes this cycle particularly damaging is how normalized it feels. Many environments reward those who endure quietly and label them as reliable, easy to work with, or low maintenance. Meanwhile, the emotional cost of this endurance is ignored. You are praised for resilience while being deprived of respect. Over time, you may begin to believe that this is simply the price of stability, that self-silencing is a necessary trade-off for security. But stability built on self-erasure is fragile, and it eventually collapses inward. Breaking this pattern does not require sudden confrontation or dramatic declarations. It begins with internal honesty, with acknowledging that silence has been costing you more than it has been protecting you. It involves recognizing that your voice is not a threat to professionalism, but a component of it. Speaking up does not mean being confrontational, it means being congruent, aligning your actions with your values and your inner truth. When you start honoring your internal signals, even privately at first, something shifts. You become more grounded. Your decisions carry clarity instead of fear. You begin distinguishing between moments where silence serves you and moments where it diminishes you. This discernment is a form of strength that does not demand attention, but it restores integrity. The slow damage of silence can be repaired the moment you choose presence over suppression. The moment you stop abandoning yourself for the sake of appearing composed. Because true professionalism does not require you to disappear, and real strength is not measured by how much you can endure quietly, but by how faithfully you remain connected to yourself while navigating challenge. Reclaiming inner authority, so disrespect loses access to your mind and home. There comes a point where endurance must give way to authorship, where surviving an environment is no longer enough and reclaiming authority becomes necessary. Reclaiming authority does not mean overpowering others or raising your voice. It means restoring your right to decide what enters your inner world and what does not. Workplace disrespect only follows you home when it is granted mental residency. It lingers because it has not been filtered, named, or released. The final step in breaking its influence is not confrontation, but ownership. Ownership of your attention, your boundaries, and your self-definition. True authority begins internally. It is the moment you stop outsourcing your sense of worth to systems that measure value through productivity, compliance, or convenience. When your inner authority is weak, every remark carries excessive weight, every omission feels personal, and every setback feels like a verdict. But when inner authority is restored, feedback becomes information rather than identity, and silence from others no longer translates into judgment. You begin to understand that not everything directed at you is about you, and not everything you feel requires self-blame. One of the most powerful shifts occurs when you stop replaying disrespect in your mind. Mental replay is how external behavior becomes internal punishment. Each time you revisit a moment, you relive its emotional charge. Reclaiming authority means choosing when a thought gets airtime and when it does not. This is not denial. It is discernment. You acknowledge what happened, extract what is useful, and release the rest. In doing so, you deny disrespect the one thing it needs to survive, your continued attention. As this authority strengthens, your boundaries become quieter but firmer. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself excessively or justify your reactions. You respond instead of react. You choose clarity over compliance and composure over collapse. This does not make you distant or cold, it makes you grounded. People sense this grounding. Environments adjust to it, or they reveal themselves more clearly. Either way, you gain information rather than confusion. Reclaiming authority also changes how you come home. Home stops being a place where you collapse under accumulated tension and becomes a place of restoration again. You arrive more present, more available, because you are no longer carrying unresolved emotional residue. You leave work at work, not because the day was perfect, but because you decided it would not define your evening. This is a discipline, not a personality trait. It is practiced daily through small choices, what you dwell on, what you release, and what you remind yourself of. Another critical element of this reclamation is redefining strength. Strength is no longer measured by how much you tolerate, but by how intentionally you live. You stop confusing endurance with loyalty and silence with wisdom. You recognize that peace is not found by shrinking, but by aligning your actions with your values. This alignment restores self-respect, and self-respect changes everything. It changes how you speak, how you listen, how you move through spaces that once drained you. Importantly, reclaiming authority does not require permission. It does not wait for validation or acknowledgement. It happens internally first, often unnoticed by others, but deeply felt by you. And once it happens, disrespect struggles to maintain its grip. It may still occur, but it no longer defines the tone of your inner life. You observe it without absorbing it. You address it when necessary and disengage when appropriate. This flexibility is a sign of real power. In the end, the goal is not control over others, but stewardship over yourself. When you reclaim your inner authority, your home becomes a refuge again, your mind becomes quieter, and your sense of self becomes steadier. Disrespect loses its ability to travel with you because it no longer has a place to land, and that is not avoidance, it is mastery.